Part 2. The meaning of the Declaration. The United States of America is in most respects a nation like any other. It embraces a people who inhabit a territory governed by laws administered by human beings. Like other countries, our country has borders, resources, industries, cities, towns, farms, and factories, homes, schools, and houses of worship. And although a relatively young country, its people have a shared history of a common struggle and achievement, from carving communities out of vast, untamed wilderness to winning independence and forming a new government through wars, industrialization, waves of immigration, technological progress, and political change. However, in other respects, the United States is wildly unusual. It is a republic, that is to say, its government was designed to be directed by the will of the people rather than the wishes of a single individual or a narrow class of elites. Republicanism is an ancient form of government, but one uncommon throughout history, in part because of its fragility. It has tended to make republics short-lived. Contemporary Americans tend to forget how historically rare republicanism has been, in part because of the success of our republic in our time, which is derived in no small part from the very example and success of America. In two decisive respects, the United States of America is unique. First, it has a definite birthday, July 4th, 1776. Second, it declares from the moment of its founding not merely the principles on which a new government will be based, but it asserts those principles to be true and universal, applicable to all men and all times, as Lincoln said. The other nations may have birthdays, for instance, that would eventually evolve into the French Republic was born in 1789, when Parisians stormed the hated prison and launched the downfall of the French monarchy and its aristocratic regime. The People's Republic of China was born in 1949, when Mao Zedong, Chinese communists, and their party defeated the nationalists in the Chinese Civil War. But France and China, as nations, as people and culture inhabiting specific territories, stretch back centuries, even a millennia, over the course of many governments. But there was no United States of America before July 4, 1776. There was not yet, formally speaking, an American people. There were instead, living in the 13 British colonies in North America, some 2.5 million subjects of a distant king. Those subjects became a people by declaring themselves such, and then by winning independence through a fight, because they said that it was their right to be free. They made that assertion on the basis of principle, not blood, not kinship, or what we might call ethnicity today. Yet this fact must be properly understood, as John Jay explained in Federalist Number 2. Providence has been pleased to give this one connected country to one united people, a people descended from the same ancestors, speaking the same language, professing the same religion, attached to the same principles of government, very similar in their manners and customs, and who, by their joint counsels, arms, and efforts, fighting side by side throughout a long and bloody war, have nobly established general liberty and independence." End quote. Yet, as Jay and all the founders well knew, the newly formed American people were not quite as homogeneous in ancestry, language, or religion as this statement would seem to assert. There were neither wholly English, nor wholly Protestant, nor wholly Christian. Some other basis would have to be found and asserted to bind the new people together, and to which they would remain attached if they were to remain a people. That basis was the assertion of universal and eternal principles of justice and political legitimacy. But this too has to be qualified. Note that Jay lists 6 factors binding the American people together, of which the principle is only one: the most important or decisive one, but still only one, and insufficient by itself. The American founders understood that for republicanism to function and endure, a Republican people must share a large measure of commonality in manners and customs and language and dedication to the common good. All states, all governments make some claim to legitimacy, that is, an argument for why their existence and specific form are justified. Some dismiss all such claims to legitimacy as false, advance to fool the ruled into believing that their rulers' actions are justified, when in fact, those actions only serve the private interest of a very few. But no actual government understands itself this way, much less any such cynical claim in public. All actual governments rather understand themselves as just and assert a public claim as to why. Well, at the time of the American founding, the most widespread claim was the form of the divine right of kings. That is to say, the assertion that God appoints some men or some families to rule and consigns the rest to be ruled. The American founders rejected that claim, as the 18 charges leveled against King George in the Declaration of Independence makes very clear. Our founders considered the British government of the time to be oppressive and unjust. They had no wish to replace the arbitrary government of one tyrant with that of another, however. More fundamentally, having cast off their political connections to England, our founders needed to state a new principle of political legitimacy for their new government. As the Declaration of Independence puts it, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind required them to explain themselves and justify their actions. But they didn't merely wish to assert that they disliked British rule and so were replacing it with something better that they liked. They wished to state justification for their actions and for the government to which it would give birth. And they wanted something that was both true and moral. Moral because it is faithful to the truth about things. Such a justification could only be found in the precepts of nature, specifically human nature, accessible to the human mind, but not subject to the human will. Those precepts, whether understood as created by God or simply as eternal, are a given that man did not bring into being and cannot change. Hence, the Declaration speaks of both the laws of nature and nature's God, and it appeals to both reason and revelation as the foundation of the underlying truth of the document's claims, and for the legitimacy of this nation. The core assertion of the Declaration and the basis of the founders' political thought is that all men are created equal. Now, from the principle of equality, the requirement for consent naturally follows. If all men are equal, then none might rule over another without his consent. The assertion that all men are created equal must also be properly understood. It doesn't mean that all human beings are equal in wisdom, courage, good looks, or any of the other virtues and talents that God and nature distribute unevenly among the human race. It means, rather, that human beings are equal in the sense that they are not by nature divided into castes, with natural rules and those who would be ruled. Thomas Jefferson liked to paraphrase the Republican political thinker Algernon Sidney. He said, quote, "The mass of mankind has not been born with saddles on their backs, nor a favored few booted and spurred, ready to ride them legitimately by the grace of God," end quote. Superiority of talent, even a superior ability to rule, is not a divine or natural title or warrant to rule. George Washington, surely one of the most able statesmen who ever lived, never made such an outlandish claim, and indeed vehemently rejected such assertions made by others about him. As Abraham Lincoln would later explain, there was no urgent need for the founders to insert into a merely revolutionary document this abstract truth applicable to all men and all times. They could simply have told the British king that they were separating and left it at that. But they enlarged the scope of their declaration so its principles would serve as a rebuke and a stumbling block to the very harbingers of reappearing tyranny and oppression. The finality of that truth, that all men are created equal, was intended to make impossible any return to formal or legal inequality, whether to such older forms as absolute monarchy and hereditary aristocracy, or to, as of yet, unimagined forms that we might be seeing in these recent times. Natural equality requires not only the consent of the governed, but also the recognition of fundamental human rights, to include, but not limited to, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, as well as the fundamental duty or obligation of all to respect the rights of others. These rights are found in nature, not created by man or the government. Rather, men create governments to secure these natural rights. Indeed, the very purpose of our government is to secure these rights, which exist independently of government. Whether the government recognizes them or not, a bad government may deny or ignore natural rights and even prevent their exercise in the real world, but it can never negate or eliminate them. The principles of the Declaration are universal and eternal, yet they were asserted by a specific people for a specific purpose in a specific circumstance. The general principles stated in the document explain and justify the founders' particular actions in breaking off from Great Britain. They also explain the principles upon which they would build their new government. These principles apply to all men, but the founders acted to secure only American rights, not those of all men. The world is still and always will be divided into nations, not all of which will respect the rights of their people, though they should. We confront, finally, the difficulty that the eternal principles elucidated in the Declaration were stated and became the basis for an actual government only a relatively short time ago. Yet if these principles are both eternal and accessible to the human mind, why were they not discovered and acted upon long before 1776? Well, in a sense, the precepts of the American founders were known to prior thinkers, but those thinkers stated them in entirely different terms to fit the different political and intellectual circumstances of their times. For instance, ancient philosophers appear to teach that wisdom is a genuine title to rule, that in a decisive respect, all men are not created equal. Yet they also teach that it is all but impossible for any actual living man to obtain genuine wisdom. Even if wisdom is a legitimate title to rule, if perfect wisdom is unattainable by any living man, then no man is by right the ruler of any other except by their consent. More fundamentally, by the time of the American founding, political life in the West had undergone some changes, two momentous changes. The first was the sundering of civil from religious law with the advent and widespread adoption of Christianity. The second momentous change was the emergence of multiple denominations within Christianity that undid Christian unity and, in turn, greatly undermined political unity. Religious differences became sources of a political conflict and war. As discussed further in Appendix 2, it was in response to these fundamentally new circumstances that the American founders developed the principle of religious liberty. While the founders' principles are both true and eternal, they cannot be understood without also understanding that they were formulated by practical men to solve real-world problems. For the founders' solution to these problems, we have to turn to the Constitution,